Oh, hey. Hey there. Hey, I was muted, slash didn't have my mic turned on. So let me reread all of this. Yeah. Introduction to the CSS Flexbox challenges. A website's user interface has two components. First, there are the visual elements, such as colors, fonts, and images. Let me also get some tunes going. So here we can hide this. Just hit play. Make sure this is turned down. Second, there is the placement or positioning of those elements. In responsive web design, a UI layout must accommodate many different browsers and devices accessing the content. CSS3 introduced flexible boxes, or Flexbox, to create page layouts for a dynamic UI. It is a layout mode that arranges elements in a predictable way for different screen sizes and browsers. While somewhat new, all popular modern browsers support Flexbox. This section covers how to use Flexbox and the different layout options it offers. So let's get started. Anyways, actually, before we get started, as I was saying when I was muted, today, if it wasn't super obvious, we are learning CSS Flexbox. We may or may not get into CSS Grid if this is short enough. And after that, we have our responsive web design projects. Before I do those, I might update my ViewPress website one stream, depending on if they've put out a new version, which I believe they have. Alright, so let's get back to this first lesson. CSS Flexbox. Use display flex to position two boxes. This section uses alternating challenge. Hold on a second. I am just all sorts of behind today. This section uses alternating challenge styles to show how to use CSS to position elements in a flexible way. First, a challenge will explain theory, then a practical challenge using a simple tweak component will apply the Flexbox concept. Placing the CSS property display flex on an element allows you to use other flex properties to build a responsive page. Add the CSS property display to box container and set its value to flex. Display flex. Cool. Let's run our tests, and we've passed. Excellent. Add flex superpowers to the tweet embed. To the right is the tweet embed that will be used as the practical example. Some of the elements would look better with a different layout. The last challenge demonstrated display flex. Here you'll add it to several components in the tweet embed to start adjusting their positioning. Add the CSS property display flex to all of the following items. Note that the selectors are already set up in the CSS. Header, the header's profile name, H3, headers H3 and H4, the footer, and the footer's stats. Okay. So we're going to do display flex. We're going to hit Command C to copy this. And paste one here. And paste one here. And paste one here. And one here. And another one here. And that does look way better already. Use the flex direction property to make a row. Adding display flex to an element turns it into a flex container. This makes it possible to line any children of that element into rows or columns. You do this by adding the flex direction property to the parent item and setting it to row or column. Creating a row will align the children horizontally, and creating a column will align the children vertically. Other options for flex direction are row reversed and column reverse. The default value for flex direction property is row. Add the property flex direction to the box container element and give it a value of row reverse. So this should reverse the colors because it's default of a row. Ready. And we see that it does just that. Maybe later. CSS Flexbox. Apply the flex direction property to create rows in the tweet embed. The header and footer in the tweet embed example have child items that could be arranged as rows using the flex direction property. This tells CSS to align the children horizontally. Add the CSS property flex direction to both the header and footer and set the value to row. So we got our header here, and we want to set it to row. Isn't that the default? The last two challenges use the flex direction property set to row. This property can also create a column by vertically stacking the children of a flex container. Add the CSS property flex direction to the box container element and give it a value of column. Flex direction column. And we're back to where we started-ish, maybe. Excellent. CSS Flexbox. Apply the flex direction property to create a column in the tweet embed. The tweet embed header and footer used the flex direction property earlier with a row value. Similarly, the items inside the profile name element would work well stacked as a column. Add the CSS property flex direction to the header's profile name and set the value to column. Sometimes the flex items within a flex container do not fill all the space in the container. It is common to want to tell CSS how to align and space out the flex items a certain way. Fortunately, the justifiedContent property has several options to do this, but first, there is some important terminology to understand before reviewing those options. Here's a useful image showing a row to illustrate the concepts below. Recall that setting a flex container as a row places the flex items side by side from left to right. A flex container set as a column places the flex items in a vertical stack from top to bottom. For each, the direction the flex items are arranged is called the main axis. For a row, this is a horizontal line that cuts through each item, and for a column, the main axis is a vertical line through the items. There are several options for how to space the flex items along the line that is the main axis. One of the most commonly used is justifiedContent center, which aligns all the flex items to the center inside the flex container. Other options include flex start, which aligns items to the start of the flex container. For a row, this pushes the items to the left of the container. For a column, this pushes the items to the top of the container. Flex end aligns items to the end of the flex container. For a row, this pushes the items to the right of the container. For a column, this pushes the items to the bottom of the container. Space between aligns items to the center of the main axis with extra space placed between the items. The first and last items are pushed to the very edge of the flex container. For example, in a row, the first item is against the left side of the container, the last item is against the right side of the container. Then the other items between them are spaced evenly. Space round, similar to space between, but the first and last items are not locked to the edges of the container. The space is distributed around all items. An example helps show this property in action. Add the CSS property's justifiedContent to the box container element and give it a value of center. justify-content, center, boom. Bonus. Try the other options for the justify content property in the code editor to see their differences, but note that a value of center is the only one that will pass the challenge. So we have our center. Flex start is the default, I believe. Or gives us what we had at the beginning. If we do flex end, it will shove them to the right. Space between should give us the blue on the left, the burnt orange all the way to the right, and gray in the middle. Yep, okay, and space around will give us a striped effect. That's cool. Cool stuff. Alright, let's put it back to center. And try to pass the test. We have. Great. Use the justify content property in the tweet embed. The last challenge showed an example of the justify content property. For the tweet embed, the property can be applied to align the items in the profile. This property can be applied to align the items in the profile name element. Add the CSS property justify content to the header's profile name element and set the value to any of the options from the last challenge. Any of them? I like this one. Align elements using the align items property. The align items property is similar to justify content. Recall that the justify content property aligned flex items along the main axis. For rows, the main axis is a horizontal line, and for columns, it's a vertical line. Flex containers also have a cross axis, which is the opposite of the main axis. For rows, the cross axis is vertical, and for columns, the cross axis is horizontal. CSS offers the align items property to align flex items along the cross axis. For a row, it tells CSS how to push the items in the entire row up or down within the container. And for a column, how to push all the items left or right within the container. Different values available for align items include flex start, which aligns items to the start of the flex container. For rows, this aligns items to the top of the container. For columns, this aligns items to the bottom of the container. Flex end aligns items to the end of the flex container. For rows, this aligns items to the bottom of the container. For columns, this aligns items to the right of the container. Center, which aligns items to the center. For rows, this vertically aligns items equal space above and below the items. For columns, this horizontally aligns the items equal space to the left and right of the items. Stretch, which stretches the items to fill the flex container. For example, rows items are stretched to fill the flex container top to bottom. Baseline, which aligns items to their baselines. Baseline is a text concept. Think of it as a line that the letters sit on. As an example helps to show this property in action. Add the CSS property align items to the box container element and give it a value of center. Let's align these items to the center. Alright. Bonus, try the other options for align items property in the code editor to see their differences, but note that the value of center is the only one that will pass this challenge. So we have flex start. We have flex end. We have stretch, which seems to be the default, and baseline. Cool. Use the align items property in the tweet embed. The last challenge introduced the align items. They didn't like my choice. This property can be applied to a few tweet embed elements to align the flex items inside them. Add the CSS property align items to the header's follow button element. Set the value to center. Align items center. Nice. Ooh. CSS Flexbox. Use the flexwrap property to wrap a row or column. CSS Flexbox has a feature to split a flex item into multiple rows or columns. By default, a flex container will fit all flex items together. For example, a row will all be on one line. However, using the flexwrap property, it tells CSS to wrap items. This means extra items move into a new row or column. The breakpoint of where the wrapping happens depends on the size of the items and the size of the container. CSS also has options for the direction of the wrap. No wrap, this is the default setting and does not wrap items. Wrap wraps items from left to right if they are in a row, or top to bottom if they are in a column. And wrap reverse, which wraps items from bottom to top if they are in a row, or left to right if they are in a column. Current layout has too many boxes for one row. Add the CSS property flexwrap to the box container and give it a value of wrap. Flex wrap. Let's wrap. And if we did wrap reverse and reverse them, great. CSS Flexbox. Use the flexshrink property to shrink items. So far, all the properties in the challenges apply to the flex container, parent of the flex items. However, there are several useful properties for the flex items. The first is the flexshrink property. When it's used, it allows an item to shrink if the flex container is too small. Items shrink when the width of the parent's container is smaller than the combined widths of all the flex items within it. The flexshrink property takes numbers as values. The higher the number, the more it will shrink compared to the other items in the container. For example, if one item has a flexshrink value of 1 and the other has a flexshrink value of 3, the one with the value of 3 will shrink 3 times as much as the other. Add the CS property flexshrink to both box 1 and box 2. Give box 1 a value of 1 and box 2 a value of 2. So adding this, we should expect box 1 to be 1/3 the size. Should be half the size of box 2, right? Yes. So a third was right. Great. Use the flexgrow property to expand items. The opposite of flexshrink is the flexgrow property. Recall that flexshrink controls the size of the items when the container shrinks. The flexgrow property controls the size of items when the parent container expands. Using a similar example from the last challenge, if one item has flexgrow value of 1 and the other has a flexgrow value of 3, the one with the value of 3 will grow 3 times as much as the other. Okay, so it wants us to add the CSS property flexgrow for both of these. This will have a value of 1. and this will have a value of 2. CSS Flexbox. Use the flex basis property to set the initial size of an item. The flex basis, I haven't heard of this one, property specifies the initial size of the item before CSS makes adjustments with flexshrink or flexgrow. The units used by the flex basis property are the same as other properties, px, em, %, etc. The value auto sizes items based on the content. Set the initial size of the boxes using flex basis. Add the CSS property flex basis to both box 1 and box 2, giving box 1 a value of 10 em and the box 2 value of 20 em. Flex basis 10 em. And this one flex basis 20 em. Alright. Use the flex shorthand property. There's a shortcut available to set several flex properties at once. The flexgrow, flexshrink, and flexbasis properties can all be set together by using the flex property. For example, flex 1, 0, 10 pixels will set the item to flexgrow 1, flexshrink 0, and flexbasis 10 pixels. The default property settings are 0, 1, and auto. Add the CSS property flex to both box 1 and box 2. Give box 1 the value, so its flexgrow is 2, its flexshrink is 2, and its flexbasis is 150 pixels. And give box 2 the value, so its flexgrow is 1, its flexshrink is 1, and its flexbasis is 150 pixels. These values will cause box 1 to grow to fill the extra space at twice the rate of box 2 when the container is greater than 300 pixels, and shrink at twice the rate of box 2 when the container is less than 300 pixels. 300 pixels is the combined size of the flex basis values of the two boxes. So maybe we should try to get this to let us move stuff around. That's actually pretty cool. So when it grows, the blue is getting bigger, but as it shrinks, red takes over. That's pretty sweet. Pretty sweet stuff. Whoa. I kind of need this. Thank you. Thank you. Come on now. Yeah. Alright. Let's run these tests. We've passed. Sounds like boss battle music. Use the order property to rearrange items. The order property is used to tell CSS the order of how flex items appear in the flex container. By default, items will appear in the same order they come in the source HTML. This property takes numbers as values, and negative numbers can be used. Add the CSS property for order to box 1 and box 2. Give box 1 a value of 2 and box 2 a value of 1. So this should just reverse them. CSS Flexbox use the align self property. The final property for flex items is align self. This property allows you to adjust each item's alignment individually. Instead of setting them all at once, this is useful instead of setting them all at once. This is useful since other common adjustment techniques using the CSS properties float, clear, and vertical line do not work on flex items. Align self accepts the same values as align items and will override any values set by the align items property. Add the CSS property align self to box 1 and box 2. Box 1 a value of center, and box 2 a value of flex end. All right. So I think that we are going to continue with the introduction to CSS Grid challenges. We got 40 minutes. Started 10 minutes late. So yeah. All right. CSS Grid helps you easily build complex web designs. It works by turning an HTML element into a grid container with rows and columns for you to place children elements where you want within the grid. Let's go to the first lesson. Turn any HTML element into a grid container by setting its display property to grid. This gives you the ability to use all the other properties associated with CSS Grid. Note, in CSS Grid, the parent element is referred to as the container and its children are called items. Change the display of the div with the container class to grid. Does it not do anything? Oh, I guess not. Simply creating a grid element doesn't get you very far. You need to define the structure of the grid as well. To add some columns to the grid, use the grid template columns property on a grid container as demonstrated below. So we have display grid already. Grid template columns 50 pixel, 50 pixels. This will give your grid 2 columns that are 50 pixels wide each. The number of perimeters given to the grid template columns property indicates the number of columns in the grid, and the value of each perimeter indicates the width of each column. Give the grid container 3 columns that are 100 pixels each. So we want to add grid template columns here. And we need to add 100 pixels 3 times. Come on. Yeah, you're way too large. The grid you created in the last challenge will set the number of rows automatically. To adjust the rows manually, use the grid template rows property in the same way you would use the grid template columns in the previous challenge. Add 2 rows to the grid that are 50 pixels tall each. Grid template rows, 50 pixels and 50 pixels. Okay. Huh. CSS Grid. Use CSS Grid units to change the size of columns and rows. You can use absolute and relative units like px and em in CSS Grid to define the size of rows and columns. You can use these as well. fr sets the column or row to a fraction of the available space. Auto sets the column or row to the width or height of its contents automatically. Percent adjusts the column or row to the parent or to the percent width of its container. Here's the code that generates the output in the preview. This snippet creates 5 columns. The first column is as wide as its content. The second is 50 pixels. The third is 10% of its container. And for the last 2 columns, The remaining space is divided into 3 sections. 2 are allocated for the 4th column and 1 for the 5th. Make a grid with 3 columns whose widths are as follows. Modify the code below. Alright. 1 fraction. The next one will be 100 pixels, and then 2 fractions. Oh, no commas. My bad. Got it. So these are 100 pixels. And then what's left of this space, this is 1/3 and this is 2/3. Something like that. Something like that. Not quite, but we're getting there. So far in the grids you have created, the columns have all been tied up against each other. Sometimes you want a gap in between the columns. To add a gap between the columns, use the grid column gap property like this. This creates 10 pixels of empty space between all of our columns. Grid column gap is gonna be 10 pixels. Cool. Oh, it wants us to give 20 though. Create a row gap with using grid row gap. You can add a gap in between the rows of a grid using grid row gap. In the same way that you added a gap in between the columns in the previous challenge. Create a gap for the rows that is 5 pixels tall. Cool. Add gaps faster with grid gap. Grid gap is a shorthand property for grid row gap and grid column gap. In the previous 2 challenges, that's more convenient to use. If grid gap has 1 value, it will create a gap between all rows and columns. However, if there are 2 values, it will use the first one to set the gap between the rows and the second value for the columns. Use grid gap to introduce a 10 pixel gap between the rows and 20 pixel gap between the columns. Grid gap, 10 pixels, 20 pixels. Perfect. Use grid column to control spacing. Up to this point, all the properties that have been discussed are for grid containers. The grid column property is the first one for use on the grid items themselves. The hypothetical horizontal and vertical lines that create the grid are referred to as lines. These lines are numbered, starting with 1 at the top left corner of the grid and move right for columns and down rows. I see. This is what it looks like for a 3x3 grid. To control the amount of columns an item will consume, you can use the grid column property in conjunction with the line numbers you want the item to start and stop at. Here's an example. Grid column 1/3. This will make the item start at the first vertical line of the grid on the left and span to the 3rd line of the grid, consuming 2 columns. Okay, 1 to 3. I don't like that slash. Hey, I didn't make it. Oh. Make the items with the classes item 5 consume the last 2 columns of the grid. So starts at 2 and then goes to 3. No, then goes to 4. Got him. Use grid row to control spacing. Of course, you can make items consume multiple rows just like you can with columns. You define the horizontal lines you want an item to start and stop at using the grid row property on a grid item. Make the element with the item 5 class consume the last 2 rows. Grid row. CSS Grid, align an item horizontally using justify self. In CSS Grid, the content of each item is located in a box which is referred to as a cell. You can align the content's position with its cell horizontally using the justify self property on a grid item. By default, this property has a value of stretch, which will make the content fill the whole width of the cell. This CSS Grid property accepts other values as well. Start aligns the content at the left of the cell, center aligns the content in the center of the cell, and end aligns the content at the right of the cell. Use the justify self property to center the item with the class item 2. CSS Grid, align an item vertically using align self. Just as you can align an item horizontally, there's a way to align an item vertically as well. To do this, you use the align self property on an item. This property accepts all the same values as justify self from the last challenge. Align the item with the class item 3 vertically at the end. Okay, it's just end. Alright. See, you highlighted it for me, make it easy. I just missed it. Align all items horizontally using justify items. Sometimes you want all the items in your CSS grid to share the same alignment. You can use the previously learned properties and align them individually, or you can align them all at once horizontally by using justify items on your grid container. This property can accept all the same values you learned about in the previous 2 challenges. The difference being that it will move all the items in our grid to the desired alignment. Use this property to center all of our items horizontally. So let's justify the items to center. CSS Grid, align all items vertically using align items. Using the align items property on a grid container will set the vertical alignment for all of the items in our grid. Use it now to move all the items to the end of each cell. Okay. CSS Grid, divide the grid into an area template. You can group cells of your grid together into an area and give the area a custom name. Do this by using grid template areas on the container like this. Grid template areas, header, 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 advert, content, content, footer, footer, footer. The code above merges the top 3 cells together into an area named header, the bottom 3 cells into a footer area, and it makes 2 areas in the middle row, advert and content. Note, every word in the code represents a cell and every pair of quotation marks represents a row. In addition to custom labels, you can use a period to designate an empty cell in the grid. Place the area template so the cell labeled advert becomes an empty cell. Place the area template so that the cell labeled advert becomes an empty cell. I believe that's it. CSS Grid, place items in grid areas using the grid area property. After creating an areas template for your grid container as shown in the previous challenge, You can place an item in your custom area by referencing the name you gave it. To do this, you use the grid area property on an item like this. This lets the grid know that you want the item 1 class to go in the area named header. In this case, the item will use the entire top row because that whole row is named as the header area. Place an element with the item 5 class in the footer area using the grid area property. Grid area footer. Got him. CSS Grid use grid area without creating an areas template. The grid area property you learned in the last challenge can be used in another way. If your grid doesn't have an areas template to reference, you can create an area on the fly for an item to be placed like this. Item 1, grid area 1, 1, 2. This is using the line numbers you learned about earlier to define where the area for this item will be. The numbers in the example above represent these values. Grid area horizontal line to start at, vertical line to start at, horizontal line to end at, and vertical line to end at. So the item in the example will consume the rows between lines 1 and 2 and the columns between 1 and 4. Use the grid area property, place the element with item 5 class between the 3rd and 4th horizontal lines between the 1st and 4th vertical lines. So grid area gird. Oh my gird. Let's see here. 3. So it would be 3, 1, 4, 4. So we got horizontal line start, which is 3rd, 3. We have vertical line start, which is 1. We have horizontal line end, which is 4. And we have vertical line end, which is 4. Okay. CSS Grid reduce repetition using the repeat function. When you use grid template columns and grid template rows to define the structure of a grid, you entered a value for each row or column you created. Let's say you want a grid with 100 rows of the same height. It isn't very practical to insert 100 values individually. Fortunately, there's a better way. By using the repeat function to specify the number of times you want your column or row to be repeated, followed by a comma and the value you want to repeat. Here's an example that would create the 100 row grid, each row at 50 pixels tall. All right. You can also repeat multiple values with the repeat function and insert the function amongst other values when defining grid structure. Here's what I mean. Grid template columns repeat to 1 fraction 50 pixels. This translates to... Okay. No, 1 fraction of 50 pixels is probably repeated twice, followed by 20 pixels. Yeah, that's what that says right there. Use repeat to remove repetition from the grid template columns property. So we'll say repeat 3, 1FR, and then we'll close this off, and that should do it. Perfect. CSS Grid, limit item size using the min-max function. There's another built-in function to use with grid template columns and grid template rows called min-max. It's used to limit the size of items when the grid container changes. To do this, you need to specify the acceptable size range for your item. Here's an example. Grid template columns, 100 pixels, min-max 50, 200 pixels. In the code above, grid template columns is set to create 2 columns. The first 100 pixels wide, and the second has the minimum width of 50 pixels and the maximum width of 200 pixels. Using the min-max function, Replace the one fraction in the repeat function with a column size that has the minimum width of 90 pixels and the maximum width of one fraction. Resize the preview panel to see this effect. So this... I think this is where it wants me to do it. 90 pixels. Yes, I would like to resize, please. Thank you. Okay. CSS Grid, create flexible layouts using autofill. The repeat function comes with an option called autofill. This allows you to automatically insert as many rows or columns of your desired size as possible depending on the size of the container. You can create flexible layouts when combining autofill with min-max. In the preview, grid template columns is set to repeat autofill min-max 60 pixels to one fraction. When the container changes size, the setup keeps inserting 60 pixels columns and stretching them until it can insert another one. No, if your container can't fit all of your items in one row, it will move them down to a new one. In the first grid, use the autofill with repeat to fill the grid with columns that have a minimum width of 60 pixels and a maximum of one fraction. Then resize the preview to see autofill in action. Wait, what? Oh. So it's set to 3 and we're changing it to autofill. Right? Auto-fill. So then we make this bigger. Oh my god. You can kind of see how it does that there. Alright. Perfect. CSS Grid, create flexible layouts using autofit. Autofit works almost identically to autofill. The only difference is that when the container size exceeds the size of all items combined, autofill keeps inserting empty rows or columns and pushes your items to the side, while autofit collapses those empty rows or columns and stretches your items to fit the container, the size of the container. Note, if your container can't fit all your items in one row, it will move them down to a new one. In the second grid, use autofit with repeat to fill the grid with columns that have a minimum width. Second grid, use autofit with repeat to fill the grid with columns that have a minimum width of 60 pixels and a maximum of 1. Alright. So we're gonna change this one now, autofit. Now we should be able to see the difference if we can get this thing to work. So it just stretches them out there. It's pretty fancy. CSS Grid, use media queries to create responsive layouts. CSS Grid can be an easy way to make your site more responsive by using media queries to rearrange grid areas, change dimensions of a grid, and rearrange the placement of items. In the preview, when the viewport width is 300 pixels or more, the number of columns changes from 1 to 2. The advertisement area then occupies the left column completely. The viewport width of 400 pixels or more is 400 pixels or more, make the header area occupy the top row completely and the footer area occupy the bottom row completely. So our goal is to make this header go all the way over and the footer as well. So right here, so we want to actually say header, header, advert content, and footer, footer. I believe that is what we want. Perfect. CSS Grid, create grids within grids. Holy moly. Turning an element into a grid only affects the behavior of its direct descendants. So by turning a direct descendant into a grid, you have a grid within a grid. Gridception. For example, by setting the display and grid template columns properties of the elements with the item 3 class, you create a grid within your grid. Turn the element with the item 3 class into a grid with 2 columns with a width of auto and 1 fraction using display and grid template columns. So we want to display this as a grid. And grid template columns, auto, 1 fraction. All right. That does it. It's 2:06. Pretty great timing. And next we have our responsive web design projects. So I'm not sure how long these will take. I'm gonna try to take a look at them and get some planning done before I start them, so it's not a cluster F. But we'll see. We'll see. Pretty excited though, because that will complete our responsive web design certification once we get these all done. Anyway, thank you to anyone that came by to give me a watch, whether it be now or later. I will be back tonight, 8 p.m. EST for some Clash Royale. And I will be back next Monday, 1 p.m. EST for some more free code camp, or perhaps updating our ViewPress blog. Hope to see you there.